Hello and welcome to my channel Key Stage 3 History with Mr. P, and this is my overview video about the Black Death. So the Black Death appeared in Europe in the 14th century. It was a disease carried by fleas on rats and was very deadly. Almost everyone who caught the Black Death died from it. The Black Death caused sweating, sickness and most commonly large buboes under the armpits and around the groin of the victims that were full of pus. The Black Death actually stayed in England until the 17th century. And in this video today I'm just going to outline some more details to you of the Black Death. So the first recorded deaths from the Black Death in England were in 1348, and between a third and a half of England's total population was killed by it. Now at the time the people called the disease the pestilence or the great mortality. And there were actually two plagues. One was the bubonic plague. The symptoms of the bubonic plague were buboes, which is where it gets its name from, which were large swellings in the armpits and groin. These spread to the whole body and were followed by blue or black blotches. Sufferers then vomited and spat blood, had seizures, their breath turned foul, and usually the victim then died. In fact, the only times when people did tend to survive was if the buboes actually burst. There was also a second form of the plague, though, known as the pneumonic plague, and the symptoms of this were fevers and then choking to death. Now, there were a number of explanations at the time for why the Black Death occurred. By far the most common that people believed to be the reason was that it was a punishment sent from God. However, beyond God punishing people, there were another number of explanations that people used for it, including the movement of planets and stars, bad air, the close alignment of the planets of Saturn, Jupiter and Mars. They blamed it on foreigners, people coming from abroad. Some even said that it was started in the east when snakes, lizards and scorpions fell from the sky and had been followed by thunder and lightning. However, today we know that the bubonic plague was caused by fleas that latched onto rats. These often travelled by ship. That's how the disease got into England. And then when they reached England and some of the rats escaped from the ship, the fleas on the rats then jumped to humans, and that's how the disease was passed. Now, this was partly also caused by overcrowded housing and dirty towns with large heaps of rubbish that attracted the rats in the first place. And the pneumonic plague was also a contagion, so also spread by being close to the plague victims. Now, at the time, as I said, people didn't know what caused the plague, therefore they tried a number of remedies, none of which really worked, but they tried them anyway. So remedies included going on a pilgrimage, so a religious journey, stopping strangers from entering your town, eating crushed emeralds. People even tried making their boils softer by pressing a mixture of onions, figs and yeast and butter onto them, and then slicing them open with a knife and scraping out the pus. A number of other weird and wacky remedies as well. So eating arsenic, cutting a live pigeon in half and rubbing it on your boils, drying a toad in the sun, then pressing it onto the boils, the buboes, so that the toad would fill up with pus until it burst, or just simply slicing open the boils and burning them with a red-hot poker. And a final way that was used to deal with the plague was throwing nicely scented herbs onto the fire to purify the air. Unfortunately, none of these remedies actually cured the plague, and therefore there were a number of results and outcomes from the Black Death. Some of these outcomes were good and some were bad, and that's what I'm going to finish my video by looking at. So the most obvious negative effect of the Black Death was that between a third and a half of the population of England and Wales died, and it took over 250 years for the population to recover to its pre-plague levels. Other negative effects were that many churches closed down because it was hard enough to find people to take over the role of priests, that some villages became totally abandoned and were never used again. Lords saw the value of their lands decrease and they lost a lot of money. Some people were worried that the disease would return any day, so lived a wild lifestyle, drinking, throwing parties and living carelessly. Less taxes also meant that future kings had to think twice about going to war because war was expensive. And a further negative outcome was to try and outdo some of the Positive outcomes, which we're going to talk about in a minute, was that harsh laws were introduced to try to stop the freedom and improvement to peasants' lives, which seems a good point to go on to some of the positive outcomes. So new medical discoveries and artistic ideas brought about a rebirth in culture in England and elsewhere. The feudal system collapsed, peasants were now free to leave their village and find work elsewhere. In the immediate aftermath, wages increased rapidly by as much as 400% because workers could demand more money because there were fewer workers alive. Poor people had improved diets, improved clothing. Peasants' attitudes towards authority changed. They believed they could stand up to authority because God had spared them from the plague. Officials over time began to realise that towns had to be cleaner in the future. And over time, medical knowledge improved as people were allowed to study the many corpses that were around. And women also had new job opportunities. These many freedoms that peasants gained often proved to be short-lived due to the Statute of Labourers that came a few years later and returned wages to pre-plague levels effectively to preserve the lifestyle of the rich. So hopefully you've enjoyed this topic summary about the Black Death. It's helped to inform you on the topic and is good for you to revise and to learn from. Thank you.